Stop crying, Sami. I told you not to wander off. Noreen's voice cracked through the frigid air, her breath fogging in desperate bursts. She wasn't shouting out of anger. She was shouting to stop herself from breaking. The trees were closing in, black, crooked arms heavy with snow, holding silence like a threat. The boy had been missing for nearly 2 hours now, 7 years old, with shoes too thin for this kind of cold. And they were too deep into the northern slopes, too far from the cabin. The wind was changing directions, confused like a thing looking for someone to blame. Arif was the first to speak again. His lips were blue, but his voice was steady. Noreen, it's not your fault we keep walking. He's moving, I know he is. Sami doesn't freeze easy. But she didn't respond. She just stared ahead, where the footprints ended, not covered. Just stopped, as if the child had been lifted, vanished. The kind of thing that breaks rules of the forest. And somewhere behind them, the dog whined. Loba wasn't even there. Dog, not really. A half-feral husky mix that had followed Arif back from the last search and rescue. She was skittish with strangers, took food from a distance, never let anyone touch her. But that morning, before they even realized Sami was gone, she was already pacing in circles outside the cabin, ears low, tail stiff. She had known. Now, she stood still in the snow, staring off toward a gully that dipped sharply down where no child would go willingly. Then she darted silent, low to the ground, not waiting for the humans. And without a word, Noreen followed. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct, the kind that burns in a mother's bones. The descent was rough, full of icy thorns and narrow paths where only something small and determined could pass. But Noreen pushed through, her gloves torn and bleeding, her voice no longer shouting, just whispering his name like a prayer, Sami, please. Then she saw the first sign. A small red glove snagged on a bare branch. Still warm, Arif's hand closed over her shoulder. Looked down in the hollow, barely, sheltered beneath a crooked rock ledge. Sami was curled into a ball, not shivering, not crying, just resting. His cheek pressed against something soft and breathing. Loba wrapped around him. Fur bristled against the storm, but she wasn't alone. There was something else behind her, not human, not dog, and it was watching them. Noreen couldn't move at first. Her eyes locked on the shape behind the dog, and her mind rejected it. Her body wanted to run to Sami, scoop him up, collapse with him in her arms, but something in her spine kept her frozen. It was the way Loba hadn't turned her head. She hadn't moved an inch since they saw her. As though holding a boundary, guarding both what was hers and what she couldn't explain. Arif stepped slightly in front of Noreen, one arm stretched out to slow her. His breath was shallow now. He had seen it to dot behind the curve of Loba's flank, just beneath the overhang of stone. Something crouched low. At first, it looked like another dog, but the color wasn't right. Too pale for the region, almost bone-colored in the snowlight, and it was too still. Its eyes glowed, not with menace but with something colder, unreadable. The forest around, it seemed to hush in recognition. Sami stirred then, groggy, blinking up at his mother with a dazed expression. I wasn't scared, he whispered, his voice hoarse and dreamy. She stayed with me the whole time. Both of them. Loba shifted, slightly, just enough to allow Sami to lift his head. Her fur was matted with ice along her back, yet she hadn't moved from her post, not once, not to lick her own wounds or shake the snow free. The boy had been her only concern, but that other thing, it didn't blink, it didn't flinch. Noreen's gaze met it, and in that one silent moment, she felt something, not a threat, but a boundary. It was there because of the child. It was still there because of the child, and it didn't want thanks. It wanted distance. Arif took a cautious step forward. Kneeling near Sami, he wrapped his scarf gently around the boy's neck and began rubbing his hands between his own to get warmth back. Loba growled low, not at Arif but at the silence. When the thing behind her finally stood, Noreen felt her stomach flip. It wasn't large, it wasn't a bear or a wolf. It was slender, wild and unknown. It had long limbs and a tail too thin for any dog. Something ancient pulsed in its form, and its breath came in slow clouds. As it moved backward, melting into the pines without a sound, only then did Loba finally exhale a deep, almost sorrowful sound, like the end of a long vigil. Noreen rushed forward then, finally, collapsing beside her son. She touched his face. He was cold but not frostbitten. He was pale but alert. There were no scratches, no bruises, just snow caked on his boots, his pants soaked through, and yet, no panic, not even fear. Sami wrapped his arms around her neck, and whispered into her collar, "They didn't let the wind get me. Loba and the quiet one. They stayed until you came." It was the way he said it, with complete trust. As if it had all made sense to him, as if he had accepted the forest's strange terms without resistance. And perhaps that's why he'd survived. Arif scanned the tree line for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing now. Just branches whispering with returning wind. Loba nuzzled Sami's hand once, then backed away. She didn't follow them when they left. She didn't even look back. The climb back to the ridge was brutal. Noreen carried Sami half the way, Arif clearing the trail. Snow had started to fall again. Slow, heavy flakes, like the forest was reclaiming what it had briefly revealed. No words were spoken about what they saw. None of it would sound sane outside those trees. At the cabin, under heavy blankets and by the fire, Sami finally fell asleep. Noreen sat beside him, holding his fingers as if afraid they'd disappear. Arif stood at the window, eyes scanning the distant tree line. "Do you think it was injured?" she asked quietly. "I don't think it was that kind of creature," he replied. Noreen frowned. "Do you think it saved him?" "I think it guarded him. Loba did the saving, and why would it help?" Arif didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because the boy never feared it. And it must have remembered what that felt like." Later that night, when the storm truly set in and the trees moaned with snow load, Noreen stepped outside briefly to breathe. The wind caught her hair, and the cold bit through her sleeves. But there, at the tree line, something faint moved just once. A pale figure, watching, not approaching, just present. And then it was gone. She didn't wake Arif, she didn't call out. She simply whispered a single word into the darkness: "Thank you." Inside, the fire crackled, and Sami stirred under the wool, one hand still outstretched in sleep, reaching toward a shape that had once kept him safe in the storm. The shape of a dog. And something older still. The storm had quieted, but only slightly enough that the sound of crunching snow returned to the forest. Not peaceful crunching, but the kind that comes with every nerve alert, every step braced for something you cannot name. Noreen could hardly feel her legs anymore. Her boots were soaked through, her knees stiff from stumbling, but her eyes never left the small form tucked beneath the rock ledge. Sami hadn't moved. Loba growled, low and guttural, not at the humans approaching, but at the shape just beyond her flank. Arif couldn't see it clearly. It blended too well into the cold and the white and the shadows, but it moved with weight, not in a threatening charge, not yet. It paced, observed, and then it let out a sound, not quite a growl, not a howl. Either it was something heavier, a warning soaked in sorrow. Noreen stepped forward before Arif could stop her, half kneeling by Sami's side. She reached for his cheek, numb fingers shaking as she cupped the boy's face. He stirred, and her breath caught. He blinked slowly, then looked up. "Mama, the dog kept me warm." Tears came, then hot and sudden and sharp. She pulled him into her arms, wrapping herself around him like she was trying to shield him from the entire world. But Arif's attention had shifted. He could see the shape more clearly now, and his mind struggled to make sense of what he was looking at. It was a wolf. At least, that's what the shape suggested. But not the kind that wandered alone, or hunted silently through pines. This one was larger than any he'd seen, coat patchy with age, one eye clouded white, and a limp in its back leg that made its movements stilted and hesitant. It didn't snarl, it didn't approach, it only sat back as if guarding or grieving. Then he saw it. Behind the wolf, barely covered by a thin sheet of snow, lay another smaller shape, still, lifeless, a pup, likely no more than a few months old. And suddenly, everything made sense. Loba hadn't been alone because she'd found the boy. She hadn't just protected Sami, she'd brought him here. To them, Noreen followed his gaze and gasped softly. "That's why she came this way." She knew, Arif murmured. She was leading him to shelter, and to them, for a long suspended moment, none of them moved. The wind whispered through the branches above, delicate and cold, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and death and something older like memory. Sami stirred again in her arms, his voice dry and cracked. The big dog didn't growl, she just watched. "She let me lie down next to Loba, then she howled once." "That's all she..." Arif asked. Sami nodded. She was sad. The old wolf made no move to leave. She simply looked at them. Not with hunger, not with fear, but with an understanding so deep it sent chills through Arif's spine. It was not an animal reacting to danger. It was a mother sitting vigil. And then, slowly, she limped forward, just enough to close the gap between herself and the small dead pup. She lay down beside it, curled around it the way Loba had curled around Sami, and closed her eyes. The growl was gone now. All that remained was breath. Shallow, slow, resigned. "We can't stay here," Arif whispered. "But we can't carry them both," Noreen said. "Not with this slope, and I can't leave her. Not like this." Loba stood suddenly, shook out her coat, then stepped toward the old wolf. She nuzzled her once firmly, with intention, and then turned to Arif and barked. Once, a short, commanding sound, as if telling him, "Move now." It took them 2 hours to get back to the trail ridge, and another hour beyond that to find the search party. They moved slowly, Arif carrying Sami in his arms, Noreen at his side, with Loba never straying more than a few feet away. None of them spoke much. The cold wasn't the enemy anymore. It was the silence that hurt most. The silence left behind by what they couldn't take with them. By the time the rescue team wrapped Sami in thermal blankets and called in the chopper, the storm had returned, soft this time, like the forest was covering its secrets again. One of the rangers tried to praise Loba, but she backed away, tail low, and disappeared into the tree line before anyone could stop her. They never saw her again. But months later, when the snow had melted and the forest paths were dry, Noreen returned alone. She climbed back down into that same gully, not out of need, but something closer to death, and what she found was quiet and peaceful. There were no bodies, no bones, only a hollow where the snow had once gathered, and a patch of fur caught on a branch, soft and gray and speckled with white, a sign, a farewell. She placed a flat stone beside the hollow, nothing carved, no name, just a weight to mark that something had mattered there. Then she sat down on the earth, closed her eyes and whispered thank you. The wind had shifted again, sharper now. It dragged the cold straight through Arif's coat and into his ribs like a warning. He hadn't spoken since they'd pulled Sammy up from the hollow. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them all was heavier than words. Noreen was cradling her son, rubbing his hands in hers. Sammy had opened his eyes, but they were glazed, dreamy, as if he hadn't quite returned from wherever his mind had gone in the storm. And Loba wasn't near him anymore. She stood at the edge of the clearing, body rigid, ears flattened, staring into the trees, not barking, not growling, just fixed, as though she was listening to something none of them could hear, or if followed her gaze. Whatever had been behind Loba in that rocky hollow, that shape in the snow shadow, that low, broad silhouette was no longer there. But its presence hadn't left. There were prints, huge ones, too wide to be canine, too fluid in stride to be a bear. They trailed away through the underbrush like the path of a ghost dragged sideways across the land. And in the center of the print, something dark. Blood. Arif squatted down. It was warm. Noreen's voice cut across the clearing, hoarse and low, like her throat was full of gravel. He said something about her not being alone. Arif turned. What do you mean? Noreen looked down at her son. Sammy was murmuring, in broken half-sentences, his small voice barely audible. The dog came back with another ... not like her. Big eyes ... quiet. Hallucination, Arif said too quickly, almost to himself. Kids see things when they're that cold, but Loba hadn't moved. And the moment Noreen stood to face her, Loba took a single step back into the trees. Then another. She wants us to follow, Noreen whispered. Arif grabbed her arm. No, we've got Sammy, we go back. Call for evac. But Noreen didn't answer. She just knelt and whispered something into Sammy's ear, something Arif couldn't hear, then handed the boy over to him, slow and deliberate. You take him, I won't go far, Noreen, I have to know. Loba was already gone. The wood swallowed her. Noreen followed. Every step she took into the frostbitten forest felt like entering a dream too vivid to be safe. The air smelled wrong, not of death, not of rot, something older. Wet bark and cold iron. The trail was marked now not by Loba's tracks alone, but by something else. Tufts of fur snagged on branches, strange indentations in the snow, not clawed, not hooved, round, as if padded, but too large and oddly spaced, and then, a sound, a whimper. Not Loba, not human, a cry low and rhythmic, like a breath trapped in sorrow. Noreen ducked under a branch and came into another clearing, this one unnaturally still. Loba sat in the center, but this time she wasn't guarding anyone. She was waiting, and just beyond her, nestled between two boulders, was what Noreen could only describe later as a den, but not a normal one. Not dug, not made. It was formed by nature, but shaped by hands or something close to them. Branches woven over stone. Inside movement, then she saw it. A second creature, not a dog, not even a wolf. Its fur was silvered with frost, its body long and low, like an ancient canine, but its eyes were human-wide, round, and terribly calm. It looked straight at her without flinching. There was no fear, no threat, only an unbearable, watchful sorrow. And curled beside it were pups, not all the same. Some looked like Loba's kind, narrow-muzzled fur, thick and brown. But one, smaller than the rest, had eyes that matched the creature. The wide-eyed one. Loba stepped closer to Noreen, then sat again, gaze flicking between her and the den. A quiet request. Noreen knelt. You weren't alone. Loba blinked. She had brought her child back, but she had left something behind. This was her second family. That the silence was broken by a crack, a gunshot in the distance. Human voices, distant but getting closer. Rescue, maybe. Rangers. Loba turned sharply toward the sound, then looked back at Noreen. There was no panic in her, only urgency. And Noreen understood. She rose slowly, backed away from the den. She didn't speak, just nodded once, chest heavy with a truth she hadn't been ready for. This wasn't just a rescue, it had been a trade. One lost child returned, one secret left untouched. By the time Arif found her again, breath ragged and fury fading to relief, she was already walking back, eyes fixed ahead. She's not coming back with us, she said softly. Arif didn't argue. He looked once into the trees, where no tracks remained, and pulled Sammy closer against his chest. Loba's shape vanished behind the trees. Swallowed by the cold and the bond of blood, one family found, the other left to the silence of the mountains. They didn't speak again until the cabin lights flickered in the distance. The snow had thickened by morning, not in a violent way, just steady, patient, as if the forest was slowly covering its own memories. Noreen sat beside the fire, Sammy asleep under 3 wool blankets. His breaths, shallow, but even the ranger team had come in the early hours. bringing thermal wraps, questions, and quiet disbelief when they saw the child alive, limbs unbroken, pulse intact. No one asked too many questions about how he'd survived that long in the cold, and no one noticed that Loba wasn't there. Rare watched from the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable. When the others left the room, he finally stepped forward. They'll want to know more. They'll say it doesn't add up. A child alone in the snow for 8 hours. No frostbite. No trauma. He paused, looking down at Sammy's sleeping face. You and I both know he wasn't alone. Noreen didn't answer. She stirred the fire, her hand trembling just slightly. In her mind, she could still see those wide eyes behind the branches. The den, the silence, Loba standing there. It split between two worlds, and the unspoken choice she'd made. It wasn't just survival, she said after a long while. It was protection. It was something deeper. She didn't lead us to him so she could return with us. She led us there so we could understand. Arif knelt beside her. You think that creature was what? Some kind of ancestor? Something ancient? I don't know, she whispered, but I know this. It loved her, and she trusted it. That's more truth than any answer we'll get. They both fell into silence again, letting the fire crackle and fill the space with warmth that felt earned. Sami stirred once, murmuring something that sounded like her eyes were kind. Then he turned and settled deeper into the blankets. By noon, the rescue crew had cleared out. A helicopter had arrived, but Sami didn't need evacuation. The doctor's words were baffled but clear. Stable, no hypothermia, just sleep-deprived. A miracle, they said. Noreen just nodded. Outside, the snow was undisturbed. No paw prints, no tracks. But when Arif walked to the edge of the clearing to light a cigarette, he stopped suddenly. There, on the lowest branch of a pine, hung a single piece of red yarn, frayed damp, a torn thread from Sammy's winter hat. It hadn't been there yesterday. He didn't touch it, just looked at it for a long time, until the cigarette burned down between his fingers. Then he went back inside. Later that night, as they packed to leave the cabin, Noreen paused at the threshold and looked back at the woods. The trees were quiet, the shadows deep. Somewhere out there, a family remained untouched by the world's explanations. She gave him back, she said softly, because she knew we'd understand. And with that, they left the mountain behind. Snow kept falling, and somewhere deep within those woods, beyond the hollow and the woven den, a low cry echoed. Once a mother's call, answered by silence, then soft footfalls moving deeper into the dark.